Hi, my name is Lukas Ley, and today I would like to introduce you to my relatively new book, Building on Borrowed Time, Rising Seas and Failing Infrastructure in Semarang, which was published in 2021 by the University of Minnesota Press. And I would like to acknowledge the wonderful help of Jesse Henderson in helping me to rewrite my dissertation into this book. So this book draws on my PhD research that I conducted in Semarang, which is a coastal metropolis of Java in Indonesia. I mainly conducted research among riverside residents of Kemijen, which is a neighborhood that is regularly flooded, or at least at the time between 2014 and 15, it was regularly flooded due to tidal inflow that the drainage channel couldn't hold any longer, because the drainage system in Semarang and in many other coastal cities of Indonesia and Southeast Asia is built based on gravity. I ethnographically look at the experience and the production of this tidal inundation crisis, which since the 90s has become a chronic situation in this area, and people have to regularly adapt their houses, raise the foundations of the houses, renovate roofs, and also adjust street levels to the rising seas. What I found particularly mind-blowing about life on the former wetlands in northern Semarang was this indispensable role of repair that not only residents engaged in regularly, but also state agencies and NGOs, universities, because this area is sinking so fast and the state has largely ignored this difficulty of living on the former wetlands and in this coastal area, which is regularly flooded. Because of this state abandonment, which is often how residents experience it, they have to themselves think about solutions to infrastructural breakdown. Sometimes this gives also rise to very uncoordinated repair efforts, which can then undermine each other. And I'm thinking, for instance, of one particular neighborhood group which is somehow more adept at generating funds from public agencies, but then the adjacent neighborhood group, which is also affected by flooding, is suddenly closer to the sea level, so to water level in the drainage tract, and therefore they might be more susceptible to being flooded that year. So this is something that was really mind-blowing, that people have to constantly think about repair and adjustments and still sense a kind of buoyancy or a kind of sense of community that is very strong in this area. And so even though people are flooded, there is still very strong solidarity among members of a neighborhood group. And I was often very touched by this buoyancy that exists in an area that is experiencing this infrastructural breakdown on a regular basis. What surprised me most about my findings was that flooding was experienced by many riverside residents as a normal occurrence. They described rob, which is the Indonesian term for tidal flooding, as rezeki, which is the Indonesian term for fortune or for income. So this disaster, it would also generate, as I mentioned earlier, a sense of community, a sense of belonging, and it also allowed people to demonstrate a long-standing attachment to this area and to the land. And of course, because repair and adjustment is requires contractors and requires substances and materials, and transporting these to this area from the hinterland, from the mountainous areas, some people stood always to benefit from flooding. So flooding could even be considered an economic vein, something that structured the everyday life in the riverside kampung, which is in the Indonesian term for neighborhood. One important insight that I gained through my research and that I tried to get across in this book is that urban life in Indonesia, especially in coastal areas of Indonesia, but also elsewhere, it wouldn't be possible without these forms of building on borrowed time, without this close relationship with critical infrastructures. However, these infrastructures have an expiry date, and the question is, when are certain tipping points reached? And I had to observe that flooding is one such instance, and in many, many cases, and especially also in larger Indonesian cities, these incidents of flooding often eventually lead to sweeping evictions, which is of course an endpoint. And these forms of building on borrowed time cannot exist any longer. This book might be interesting, I believe, for cultural, social, and environmental anthropologists specifically, because I address how people live and endure on former wetlands that have been urbanized and are now threatened to become watery again. It might also be interesting to people studying urban life in Indonesia more generally, and people who are interested in state measures in the Anthropocene, sometimes very sweeping measures, such as building seawalls and conducting large-scale evictions along shorelines. And lastly, I think it might be interesting to people who sense that we live in a world that is struggling constantly with chronic crisis. I'm drawing here strongly on the work of Eric Katzin, who describes this in his book, The Already Dead, where he is looking at cancer patients. So he's looking at a very different situation, and bridging his work into anthropology and drawing on the work of Elizabeth Parvanelli, for instance, or Kim Fortune, I try to ethnographically elucidate what it means to live on borrowed time in an environmental setting.